back to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. And as usual, I'm your host, Sam Mickey. So one of the things I've been doing lately is kind of remixing some of our older episodes and focusing on different topics and common themes, commonalities that have emerged in some of these different discussions. After all, we have well over 40 episodes at this point in our archive, and it's easy to let some of these things slip through the cracks. And even if you have caught up with all of our episodes, hopefully this remix shines a new light on it and provides a new depth of understanding of some of these issues. So the issue that we're going to focus on for this episode is environmental justice and its relationship to environmental racism as well. So I have a few people to draw on some clips, including the co-founders and co-directors of Breakthrough Communities, which is an organization dedicated to building multiracial leadership for sustainable communities in California and the nation. And so we have Carl Anthony and Paloma Pavel. And Carl will talk about his work with Breakthrough Communities, as well as a little bit about his book, The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race. And then we'll hear from Paloma Pavel, who also works with Breakthrough Communities, and she'll talk about her path into this work as well. After we hear from Carl and Paloma, I'll pass it over to Christopher Carter. And the Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter is an assistant professor and the assistant chair of the Theology and Religious Studies department at the University of San Diego. And he'll talk about his work with the field of religion and ecology, particularly the ways that ecological spaces impact Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. So I hope that you find these clips as enlightening as I have. For now, we'll start by passing it over to Carl Anthony.
Well, I guess I was in a position of working for the Ford Foundation, and Dr. Pavel was director of our strategic communications agenda for the work that I was doing at Ford. And we had an opportunity to elaborate on the grants that I was giving, mostly for environmental grants for communities of color who were primarily doing other things to advance the issues of communities of color. And I saw an opportunity, and Dr. Pavel also saw the opportunity to bring the focus, bring a sharper focus on the issues of sustainability in that work at the Ford Foundation.
Nice. Yeah, really special, really great work. And I know a lot of people in the Bay Area definitely know that it's a very flagship institution around here. So also, want to hear a little bit more. I know that some stories about Breakthrough Communities are in your book, but I also want to hear a little bit more about it, especially for any of our listeners or viewers who don't know it. It's a really wonderful book, The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, yes, actually, that book is in part an autobiographical, and my intention was to lift up a set of experiences that are not that well developed within the environmental community, that positions our community at the African American community to go back to the origin of humanity. On 250,000 years ago in the Rift Valley, the Africans came down from the trees and began to walk across the savannah. And that part of that heritage, which was many thousands of years before we got enslaved by the Europeans who were coming to Africa to get a labor force, we had been developing a culture. Our ancestors were developing a culture that has a lot to do with our thinking about our climate change issues today, because the emergent issues of climate is what was responsible, in part, at least, and by some people, maybe even more than a part, for the emergence of the human race.
I really appreciate that perspective. It's so, different than the normal narrative you hear when people are talking about like environmentalism. They go back to like Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Muir, and it's this very as if it's this very recent phenomenon. And you're saying, well, actually, the history, right, of the human relationship to nature, we need to think about the entire evolutionary trajectory of the species. So you're really thinking about the human at the whole species level.
I think that's correct. And I also think that our history, speaking as African Americans, our history gives us a window on looking at all of humanity's relationship to the environment. And our recent history, which is 400 or 500 years old, uh, really emerged at a point when the Europeans were uh, really gaining a mastery of the oceans and were able to translate that to their own personal advantage, but really ignoring the profound experience of many non-European cultures, and the Africans were a part of that. So it's really adding a dimension to all of human history.
Yes, yes, exactly. And you know, sometimes I think when people get into this larger evolutionary or ecological perspective, thinking about the whole Earth even, then they miss urban issues, specifically the city. You know, a lot of ecologically minded people are always just trying to get away from the city and they want to be in the wild. And so, one of the really special things about your work is the way you focus on cities so much while also focusing on this larger evolutionary narrative. So, for you, what's the role of the city in human evolution or in our current historical moment?
Well, you know, the primary relationship between people and the cities uh, grew up at the time that people began to develop an approach to agriculture. And the cities were an important uh, contribution to those efforts. And I would say maybe 20,000 years ago or 15,000 years ago, when many of the ancient civilizations began to emerge, uh, there was a great deal of work that was underway within the African American community on the African community on those important uh, changes that were happening uh, in the human relationship to the environment, and the city was an important part of that.
And so then for the future of humanity, to have a sustainable relationship and a just relationship to the earth, we can still have cities, but obviously the way we're currently planning them and organizing them isn't really getting it done.
Yeah, that's right. And so our historical experience is also a critique of the sort of dominant view of the cities, which is not so much related to nature as it is related to accumulation of capital and the creation of human power in the larger universe, ignoring the ecological foundation of that in our exploitation of the resources of nature.
All right, big thanks to Carl Anthony. Now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Paloma Pavel to talk about her perspective on this work and the way that her life has brought her to engage these kinds of issues as well.
Well, thank you, Sam. Let's see. I grew up in a second generation immigrant family from Czechoslovakia, and my grandparents did not speak English, and that and were very knowledgeable of land-based wisdom. My grandmother was somewhat of a nature mystic and also healer in her own right. And she also was my first deep ecology teacher in her garden, learning about how plants grew, but also she would sort of show me the coils of the garlic and the swirl on the top of my head and my hair, and also talk about the Milky Way, and really conveyed a sense of how I belonged to this universe, that we all do. And through that nature-based learning was a profound, profound teacher about kind of an early prefigurement of the universe story in my own life. And Growing up, actually at the border in Southern California, La Frontera, and my father was a humanitarian doctor, and we would cross the border, and I would see e- the 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 gaps between language, class, how I could cross and return, but my friends and kids that I was meeting and growing up with, beginning at age 6, crossing every Saturday, were unable to come with me. And so in some ways that divide I've been bridging that, seeking to build those bridges and heal those divides of race and class and international arbitrary walls for ever since. That's really been the nature of my work. And as I began to be more aware of these converging crises, environmental and the carrying capacity of the earth, and Donello Meadows and the Club of Rome's work, I reached a kind of existential crisis in my early adulthood, and found myself called to a retreat time in a Benedictine monastery in silence. And it was there really focused on the kind of ecological crisis of our time, and seeing that we were on kind of a suicide mission, the sixth great extinction, as Brian and others, Brian Swim and others have named it for us. And so at that time, I just saw that that was really the rededication when I came out of the contemplative structure of the monastery. I continued to hold that as a guiding principle in my life, both the contemplative roots of both Christian and earth-based spirituality that we were exposed there with Brother David Steindl-Rast and other guest teachers from around the world who were with us on the coast of Maine. And it led me to start my own deep ecology retreat center, also nearby, and where we learned from nature. So I became a registered Maine guide and led wilderness trips into the mountains, down rivers, kayaking to islands, and with the reverse principle of many outdoor experiences, which is not sort of human man over nature, but actually apprenticing from living systems and learning from the ecology surrounding us. So those early years were very formative, and as much as any part of my formal education, I consider the learning among living systems without running water or electricity for 7 years, and building a house and 11 buildings at our center by hand, and hauling water and cutting wood and welcoming guests there from throughout US and sometimes from other countries. Those were really my spiritual teachers, and have taught me, I think what I stand in with greatest confidence is that learning about the cosmological cycles of our planet, and how, just like in the monastery where you honor the hours of the day, we would be very much informed by not only the hours of the day, but the seasons, and when it's below zero for 30 days at a time, and cutting with wood. So I think that in meeting Thomas Berry, it was as though some deeply deep longing of accompaniment in my own quest that had been planted in me in the seeds of my grandmother's garden were really hatching, and watered and nourished by this profound synthesis that Thomas brought forward, and which really it was like a coming home, such a deep, profound coming home that not only informed and continued to inform the work at our rural center, but also I felt called to seminary, um, and uh, and during that time worked on the anti-apartheid uh, campaign with Desmond Tutu and his guidance, and he became a lifelong mentor alongside Thomas. I would say that sense of kind of the spiritual, contemplative, geologian side, and then the activist, um, social and racial justice side. Those two figures um, have really informed and guided much of the work. And so when I met Carl um, in the Bay Area, where I was a professor of organizational development and social transformation, and assisted him in the leadership development of his own organization. And then when he was invited to the Ford Foundation, and we worked together there, and I developed the peer-to-peer learning and the really worked with Carl on the strategy of how could we really bring a radical opening and listening to communities and their learning and teaching of each other. What might that hatch? What might that evolve? And especially having it rooted and grounded in a sense of deep time, of that our human venture, which began in the Rift Valley, as far as we best understand it on this planetary time, and our particular heritage of coming to Turtle Island and the genocide and displacement, and transatlantic slave trade, and the river people like myself, my own heritage of coming as immigrants from situations of great strife in other parts of the planet. So here we are, and what can we be together? How can we be together in this new moment in 2021?
All right. Thanks so much to Paloma Pavel. Now I'm going to pass it off to Reverend Dr. Christopher Carter, and he'll talk to us about his work with environmental justice at the intersection of religion and ecology.
I come at this from multiple perspectives, but I will say the genesis of my thinking about the environment is my grandfather, as you see pictured with my son Isaiah. My grandfather was born in the 1930s in Mississippi. He was a migrant farmer and a picker, I guess is probably the more accurate term, and just had to deal with a lot of particular kind of racism in the midst of living during the era of Jim Crow. And so, as a consequence, he left the South and moved to Michigan, and that's where I was born. My mother was born, and myself, and has always been committed to kind of not only sharing those stories about his experience of growing up in Mississippi and spending a lot of time in Louisiana, but also the ways in which he really loved the land and how him and his gardening, as he called it, but quite honestly was basically like a farm in the backyard of his house in the middle of nowhere in the country, really made an impression on me that I hadn't really interrogated until I got older. And I connect this right now with my son, Isaiah. And so a lot of what I think about in terms of how my work, the writing that I do, is really not only to speak to the legacy of my grandfather and those who came before me and the road that they laid and the path that they paved for me to be here, and honoring their agricultural legacy, their culinary legacy, and speaking true to the ways in which they understood the environment, how they lived within the environment, but also trying to provide and leave a footprint or framework for my son and future generations to look at ecology in ways in which the contributions, I should say, to ecological thought from Black perspectives and see them as having deep and profound value that continue to shape and reshape, again, how we interact with the non and more than human world. You see on the bottom of that is one of my some it's a vegan Spanish paella. It's probably one of the best things I've ever made in my life. And I note that it's vegan because that is a big part of my ecological commitment. For me, my commitment to this way of being in the world is centered on for the people. And I always say, like, I love animals and animals are great, but a lot of my work, again, talks about food and the ways in which environmental and food policies impact and harm people of color. And as such, this has been a big moral and ethical way for me to contribute to actually my kind of activism, I guess, for lack of a better term. So a little bit about my academic work. As I said, my academic work explores religion and ecology through the lens of race, food, and non-human animals. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those areas. First, my forthcoming book, The Spirit of Soul Food. I really sought to answer the question, what should soul food look like for Black folks, given the structural racism that is embedded into the domestic and global food systems? And so ultimately, I argue that in order for first that all people should take food seriously, but particularly Black people and Black Christians should begin to think theologically about food and to adopt a different way of eating. I call it different food ways as a response to systemic racism. And so the way I argue it is that we need to consider not only what we eat, but how we access our food and how we might create food sovereign communities, right? To empower people to have better choices and better access and better health consequences in light of the food that we are currently eat today. For me, I argue that one of the pillars of this way of eating is called soulful eating. Soulful eating at its best is vegan, but even when it's not vegan per se, it interrogates the ways in which white supremacist thinking is embedded into the ways in which we think about food, food that Black people consume, specifically tying it back to the kind of racialized narratives about food that emerged during the enslavement of Black people. And Spirit of Soul Food should be out in June of 2021. So really looking forward to that actually being published. Next is Prophetic Labrador. So this book actually is one of the more personal things I've ever written. It was about my dog Samson when he passed away, and just the way in which it transformed my thinking about the non-human world and how we relate to it and connect to it. I wanted people to start thinking theologically about the non-human world, but particularly I wanted Black people to start thinking about this in ways, and I wanted white people who were already thinking about the more than human world to understand and interpret it and have some encounter with it from the experience of a Black person. And so suffice it to say, for me, not only was this article personal, it really pushed me to broaden my understanding of community, the theological notion of community. So it's in the book, A Feeling Animal Death. Again, it's just a chapter, but it's probably the most personal thing I've ever written. This chapter right here, Blood in the Soil, was published a few years ago. That gets at more of the ecological work that I do, right? So we talked about food, we talked about animals, so a little bit about the ecological work that I do. Basically, in this chapter, I argue that the framework, the theoretical framework for how we think about and talk about environmentalism is steeped in in the language of whiteness, right? And so much of the challenge that has prevented the environmental movement from diversifying, if you will, is because not only the language, but some of the ideological foundations that uphold these ways of being in the world, again, really are also tied into the ways in which white supremacist structure is upheld. And so I argue and talk about and try to posit different ways for people of faith, particularly Christians, to rethink what it means to be human in ways that could empower us and cause us to, again, broaden our perspective on what it means to be a human being and relate to and connect with and recognize our interconnectedness to the non-human world. So my professional work spans the spectrum. I am the chairperson, or I guess the co-chair of the Religion and Ecology Unit at the American Academy of Religion. I'm a board member of Farm Forward and at Creature Kind, and both of these. So Farm Forward is a nonprofit that focuses on food policy, specifically as it relates to farmed animals, and Creature Kind is a Christian organization that is encouraging a vegan and vegetarian kind of lifestyle from a theological perspective. Lastly, I am one of the co-founders of Racial Resilience. And Racial Resilience is an anti-racism training program that uses the combined insights of contemplative practices and critical race theories. And I'm really excited about that work. And as you might suspect, given the summer we've had in 2020, I have been quite busy and active in that area of anti-racism training as well. So if you're interested in a little bit more about my work or contacting me, you can find out more of my work at drchristophercarter.com. Or if you want interested in racial resilience, you can find out information on that on racialresilience.com. Other than that, thank you so much for spending a few minutes learning a bit about me. I hope if you're interested in my work, you'll reach out to me so I can learn a little bit about you. Thank you and have a great day.
All right. Thanks so much to Christopher Carter, to Paloma Pavel, to Carl Anthony. I really appreciate their perspective on these things and hope that you did too. If you haven't seen their full episodes, there'll be some links provided to help you navigate there. If you have seen their episodes, I hope you enjoyed the remix, showing the kind of continuities there are between their thought. All right, so I'll leave it there for now. We'll be back next week with some more content for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.